Hello, welcome to the Abundance Workshops. I am Aisha McGowan, a professional cyclist for Live Racing Tech Find, and also the founder and program director of A Quick Brown Fox. A Quick Brown Fox works to build space and create opportunities for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color inside the initiative continue to show how truly we believe that representation matters. Today, we are presenting Embracing My Path to Becoming an Adaptive Athlete, a workshop led by Annijke Wade. We also want to thank our longtime sponsors, Live Cycling, Zwift, and SRAM, for supporting us over the years in our work towards creating and maintaining an authentically inclusive cycling community. This year, the Abundance Project is ecstatic to be a beneficiary of a Bronco Wild Fund grant and help further its mission to build a legacy of access to the outdoors. Bronco Wild Fund has teamed up with like-minded collaborators, agencies, organizations, and everyday heroes devoted to keeping the great outdoors great. A portion of the profits from every Bronco sold goes directly to Bronco Wild Fund collaborator initiatives like this one. Thanks so much to Bronco Wild Fund for helping us present the Abundance Workshops in 2023. Annijke Wade is an adaptive mountain biker, para-off-road cyclist, and an adaptive athlete. In 2021, Annijke sustained a spinal cord injury during a mountain bike accident. Now, she is back to sport and living as a full-time wheelchair user. Outside of loving mountain biking and being outdoors, Annijke also is passionate about making the outdoors and mountain biking a safe space for all. Give a warm welcome to Annijke Wade and enjoy this presentation of Embracing My Path to Becoming an Adaptive Athlete.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annijke Wade, and I'm extremely excited to be here today. Great. Today, I'm going to be presenting on embracing my path to becoming an adaptive athlete. We're going to be covering a variety of topics, first starting off with a little bit about myself and my journey, and then eventually we'll get into different types of adaptive equipment and para-off-road cycling equipment, and a little bit about advocacy. So a little bit about who I am. My name is Annijke Wade. I have coached women's mountain biking. I'm also a clinic and skills enthusiast. I've had the privilege of racing enduro, which is a racing discipline for mountain biking. I now am an adaptive and para athlete. I consider myself a community advocate, and outside of the biking world, I'm a geospatial professional. So a little bit about my journey to becoming an adaptive athlete. A little 90-second version of my accident. Simply put, I had a tragic mountain bike accident that resulted in me breaking my back, sustaining a spinal cord injury, and becoming paralyzed. I'm now a full-time wheelchair user. My accident was about 1.5 years ago, July 17th, 2021. I'm really specific around the verbiage and language I use with describing both my disability and how I've arrived at the place of becoming an adaptive athlete. Part of this is because I really want to own my own path and narrative, and I'm really being intentional about the words that I choose. So being an athlete is extremely important to me. I was first introduced to the High Fives Foundation early on when I was still in the hospital. When I got to Craig Hospital, which is a rehabilitation center, I was given a care package from High Fives, and one of the shirts in there said athlete. And it really hit me in that moment. Even as I was laying in the hospital bed and I was, had nurses and techs attending over me, helping to put my pants on and basically helping me with all of my personal cares, I still felt like an athlete. And so I've been really intentional about owning that and carrying that through with me as I work on my recovery. So choosing to accept. The first few days in the ICU after my accident were probably the hardest. I didn't know exactly what was going on. I wasn't sure why I wasn't able to move or feel my legs. But I did know that things were pretty bad. As soon as I found out that I had a spinal cord injury, which was about 3 days after my initial accident, I felt like I was able to accept my injury and therein start to accept my fate. I always say that acceptance is a daily task. Sometimes it's a minute by minute task, and sometimes it goes even further down. But each moment of each day, I get to choose how I'm going to and if I'm going to accept my disability. Some days are harder than others, and other days I don't think about it that much. Accepting the fact that I have a disability and that I probably wouldn't walk actually allowed me to start to dream big and think about the possibilities. So once I knew that walking was no longer going to be a reality for me, was obviously really hard, right? But it allowed me to free up my mind to think about what was possible and what would be possible for me moving forward. Um, in that moment, I really started to own my own narrative and set my own path. So, very early on in the ICU, once I found out I had a spinal cord injury, I started to dream of what my life would look like. And the most important thing to me in those early moments was getting back outside and getting back on a bike. And so, anybody that would come and visit me in the ICU or the trauma unit, I would tell them, I'm going to be back on a bike. I don't know when, but it's going to happen. And then as I started to get a little bit physically better, I started to show people videos on Instagram of adaptive bikers, what maybe my bike would look like, and all of the cool things I was going to do. Once I arrived at Craig Hospital, the rehabilitation center, I began to set specific goals that would allow me to get back on the bike. Sure, I was concerned with what life would look like as a full-time wheelchair user, and maybe thinking about, modifications I would need to do to my home or to my car. But I was also more focused on getting back on a bike. Biking to me has been extremely important for my well-being, my mental health, and allows me to connect with my community. So through the recovery process, I started to connect with other adaptive athletes. I had video chats, phone calls, and messages sent over DMs with other adaptive mountain bikers. This allowed me to start to build a peer network of individuals that I could call upon as I started to engage in the process of becoming an adaptive athlete. So I now have the privilege of showing up in these spaces as a Black disabled adaptive athlete. And I have to own both of these identities and also be aware of the privileges that each has and how I show up in these spaces. Adaptive mountain biking and adaptive sports, in a lot of ways, have provided me with a safe space and safe container to be who I am. And this has allowed me to start to explore the intersectionality of these two identities, being Black and disabled. So once I got my bike, or once, I knew the day that I was going to be leaving rehab and I wanted to pick out a bike, I started to think about a few different things. What was really important for me about picking my bike, and I have a bowhead reach, which is pictured in the far right corner of this slide, is I wanted something that worked for my disability. So as a paraplegic, I don't have the use of my legs, and I have varying use of muscles, from the level of my injury, my chest down to my stomach. And so I wanted something that I was going to be able to work with and that was comfortable. I also really like the downhill and enduro style of riding. And so I wanted to find a bike that would cater to that and would allow me to still engage with the sport that I like to do. I also wanted a bike that had articulation. So it would allow me to get over some of those harder features like rock gardens. I also started to think about bike width, right? Like I wanted to still be able to access the same trails that I was used to riding. And because I'm a mountain biker and I like downhill riding, I needed a bike that had full suspension. And then I also wanted something that was all electric. As a full-time wheelchair user and a new full-time wheelchair user, I am using my arms and my shoulders for just about everything I do. And so it's really important that I'm thinking about shoulder health long term. Um, about a year before my mountain bike accident, I dislocated both shoulders. And so I was actually in the process of rehabbing those when I had my mountain bike accident. So I wanted something that would allow me to get outside and not jeopardize my shoulders. And so I landed on the Bowhead Reach. This is my bike. I have 3 pictures up here. The first one is me with my puppy Pondo. My bike also allows me to get outside on the beach and other parts of nature. So it's much more than just a mountain bike. It allows me to recreate. It's an off-road wheelchair. The picture in the center is of me getting into some shenanigans on the trail. And then the picture on the right shows the lean or articulation feature of my bike. And so it's able to lean from left to right, and each wheel on my bike has suspension. So once I got my bike, 4 months after my accident, it was time to start to learn. So learning to ride my bike has been a lot like learning a brand new sport. Sure, I had mountain biked before and I knew how to read a trail and was familiar with, the culture of mountain biking, but I was now interfacing with a brand new piece of equipment. This piece of equipment was similar to my old bike, but also had a lot of differences. So on my first ride, one of my friends, Pierre Bergman, took me out to a local city bike park, and we just practiced things like learning how to do the bike lean and articulation, working on turns, working on stopping, working on accelerating. Throughout the process of learning how to ride, I've had to practice so much patience with myself. I used to be able to do all sorts of really challenging trails, technical trails. And now through this process, I have to start over. I have to start back at the easy trails. And so sometimes I get a little frustrated when I'm trying to figure out how to approach a trail, maybe even a trail that I've been on, and what that looks like with my new body and my new piece of equipment. I also have a body that is quite frankly changing every day. I'm still very new to my injury and to my disability. I'm 1.5 years out, and my body is actually still undergoing a lot of changes. I tell my partner sometimes that every time I get on the bike, my body feels just a little bit different. And so I spend usually the first 5 to 7 minutes just figuring out what feels different and learning how to adjust. Sometimes, too, you just have to do the thing. So the only way to get better at riding is to ride. So I have kind of a funny story about a situation I encountered this summer when I was riding. So I went up to British Columbia, interior BC, to hang out with a bunch of adaptive mountain bikers at an adaptive mountain bike race series. When I was there, we were able to ride at a couple different resorts, and I was able to see all sorts of wonderful trails. The second resort I arrived at, I was feeling confident, but I was also very aware of the lack of skills I had, or rather, the areas of improvement I needed. So I get to this trail, and it is the easiest trail on the mountain, and I start to descend. As I descend, I immediately come across a feature that I have been having trouble with and working on. Those are kind of those tight berms or switchbacks that are also steep. And I got there and I just thought, oh, geez, here I am. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it. I kind of got myself into a little bit of a pickle. I got to a point where I wasn't able to really move my bike without the possibility of tipping and falling. And if I tipped and fell, I would have fallen probably about 15 feet. So I said to Clayton, my partner that I was riding with, hey, I don't know if I can make this. I'm getting really nervous. I'm out of my comfort and I just don't feel good. Luckily, there were two people that were coming up right behind us on the trail. We were able to ask them for help, and it actually took three people entirely to move me and my bike down to safer ground. I ultimately made the decision to kind of cool off and take a break because sometimes you get into that place of fear and you're not able to move forward. And so I got back from the trail and that one run, and I was pretty frustrated. I felt a little bit like a failure. Uh, it was a trail I know I could have done previously before my accident very easily, and I just didn't know why I was able to do that, why I wasn't able to do that. And I remember somebody must have maybe seen that I was a little frustrated and came up to me and talked to me and assured me that, it is hard to return to sport and it is hard to sometimes face those fears. And a lot of times, the only thing you could do is just do the thing. You just got to keep working on these skills until you get better. So, I wanted to cover a little bit about my barriers to riding. So, what are the barriers that I have encountered as a new adaptive athlete? The first thing would be transportation to the trail. So, transporting both me and my bike to trails. I do have a really cool rack for my adaptive bike, but I'm still working on being able to load that independently. Once again, I only have access to about 50% of my body. So it does take me a little bit of time and adaptability to sometimes figure these things out. Another big barrier is planning the route. So, knowing that I am a newer rider and I am approaching trails on a different piece of equipment, I have to be really careful about choosing the routes that I'm going to do. I don't want to get into situations that are unsafe. I don't want to have my partner help me too much or whoever I'm riding with help me too much. Um, and then I also need to make sure that there are some accessible features on the trail. So the third point here is knowing the accessibility of the trail. So thinking about things like, are there bridges? Are there gates? How will I go over those features? Or maybe there's a rock in the middle of the trail that would cause my bike to high center where I wouldn't be able to move. Something that's been really big, and it's a barrier, but it's also a perceived barrier for me, is learning to accept and need help on the trail. I really prided myself as being a very independent person before my accident, almost maybe to a fault. But now, as a new adaptive athlete, I have to ask for help, and sometimes I genuinely need the help. And so, something I'm really working on is figuring out ways to ask for help and how to be really specific about the help that I may need on the trail. Another barrier is bike maintenance. So, since I do have a piece of special equipment, I'm still in the learning process and phase of how to do bike maintenance myself. So, there's a lot of components that are similar to an upright mountain bike, like the brakes, the rotors, the wheels. But then there's also some specialty pieces of equipment. And so, what I'm not able to do on my own, I would take my bike to a bike shop. I have encountered some interesting things when taking my bike to a bike shop. I went to get a new tire mounted before a really long ride. And this is something I could have done on my own, but I was running out of time. And so I took my bike to the bike shop, and the first bike shop we went to said they weren't able to work on my bike. So they said, we don't do that kind of bike. And so it's really about, finding the right place and finding people that are open and accepting to work on my bike. Obviously, developing a relationship with a local bike shop is really important. But thinking about if I did have to travel or maybe, I was in a different part of town kind of how to navigate that. Another big barrier of mine is learning how to ride independently. So as I'm in this learning stage and process, I do have to ask for help and I do have to accept that help. But my ultimate goal is to be able to ride independently. A dream of mine would be able to leave my house and hit the trail and come back and not need a person's help at all. But I'm still working up to that. All right, so now we're going to kind of move into some other things that I've started to learn about adaptive mountain biking. So it's been really important for me to connect with individuals in the adaptive mountain biking and para off-road cycling space. As I had mentioned previously, I've been really lucky to have been connected to people since, the very early days of my accident. But it's been really important for me to understand what the barriers are in this sport and what it looks like for a person to engage with this sport. So I spent the last year and a half learning about different types of equipment, the different barriers to entry, what trail access looks like. I've been learning about the recognition of sport, all of the different stigmas that are around adaptive athletes and equipment, and so much more. So let's talk about adaptive mountain bikes and para off-road bikes. There are so many different styles of bikes. Some of the bikes you may see are kind of more off-the-shelf bikes. There's also highly customized bikes. And then there's also custom tools and adaptations to any of these types of bikes that allow people to ride. There's a lot of different unique styles, and there's also so many different ways people can get out there. Some of the types of bikes you may hear about are recumbent, pedal-driven, hand cycle, e-assist, also all electric, a Delta style bike, which has one wheel in the front and two in the back. There are bikes that are kneeling or prone. So you are sitting kind of on your knees in a kneeling position and operating the bike that way. There are bikes that are upright. Upright bikes are, two-wheeled cycles that most people ride. And then there are bucket bikes. There's also adaptations to any type of bike that allows a person to use it. Some of those adaptations might look like, one hand that's able to control both brakes or shifting capabilities on one side of the bike. There's also tandem bikes as well. So here's a picture of a few different adaptive mountain bikes and para off-road bikes. And this is just a small sample. These are some popular models, but believe it, there's quite a few more. That one that's on the top that has the two wheels in the front that looks like an upright bike with the bucket, that's called a bucket bike. It's kind of an interesting design. So one of the things I've been learning about are the different barriers to entry to entering into this sport. So the price of equipment. Adaptive mountain bikes and para off-road cycles are extremely expensive. They range anywhere between $10,000 to $20,000. And so thinking about how a person is able to purchase a bike like that becomes very complicated. I was very fortunate to have a lot of support that allowed me to get a bike. So my previous clothing sponsor, Pearl Izumi, and High Fives Foundation came together to allow me to have a bike. Some individuals will apply for grants, but not individuals are eligible for grants. And that kind of forces people to go through like the crowdfunding process, which, can be successful or unsuccessful depending on who you are and what your network looks like. There's also a lack of rentals and try-it programs. So, as an able bodied biker, you can go to just about any bike shop and say, I want to rent a bike for a day, or demo a bike is kind of the term. And they'll most likely be able to provide you with one or direct you to somebody that can do that service. It's relatively rare for an individual with a disability to be able to have that same access. So if I wanted to try a bike, I would have to get in touch with, adaptive sport organization or a rehabilitation center, and see if I would be able to try a bike. But, you know, those particular places are not everywhere, right? So I can't just go to any city and be able to do that. I have to really be focused on where I would access that. Another big barrier to entry is one of the barriers I've encountered is trail access. So knowing where I can ride, knowing what trails are going to be accessible, what the parking lots look like. Will I be able to park and have the ability to use, a wheelchair access van? Or let's say I am semi-ambulatory. What does the ground around the parking lot look like? There's a lot of different bits to trail access and accessibility that you really start to encounter once you're going sort of outdoors. There's also limited coaching and guiding options. So while there are adaptive mountain bike coaches and there are more and more people becoming certified, it's not as many as, sort of able-bodied mountain bike coaches. There's not a lot of clinics or options for you to begin that sport. And same with guiding too. Let's say you're on vacation and you want to just try out some of the local trails. One, you would have to find a rental or a bike if you didn't bring your own. And two, you might be interested in getting a guide or having someone show you around. And each of those things are a little bit more convoluted and complicated when we're talking about adaptive sports and adaptive mountain biking. One of the big barriers is just having knowledge of the sport, having that sort of peer network and people you can ask questions to. So fortunately, I will say that most people that do adaptive sports and para sports are awesome, and they're always willing to give you information, but you do have to have knowledge of that. You do have to know kind of who to talk to and who to engage with. And then, of course, all of the same barriers that exist with outdoor adventure and getting outside exist within adaptive mountain biking. So, as an adaptive rider, these are the things I have to consider when I'm choosing trails. I need to think about the trail width. Is my bike going to be able to fit on a trail? And the trail width and the kind of like sweet spot around that is going to vary based on the type of equipment you're riding. So my bike is no wider than traditional mountain bike handlebars. However, I have a very unique design. Not everybody has the same type of bike or the same ability or turning radius with their bike. Another thing to think about is the camber on the trail or the off camber on the trail. Off camber can present an interesting circumstance when coupled with exposure or specific trail features. So there are times when I'm riding where the trail is just snug enough to my bike. I don't have a lot of wiggle room and it's off camber and there's exposure. And this is when I typically have to ask for help. I usually have somebody spot me on the side of my bike just to ensure that I don't start to fall, off the cliff or over the hill. I also need to think about features. So I mentioned, bridges and gates, but also on the trail features. There was a time this summer when I was riding and the trail width was fine and there wasn't too much exposure, but there was a gigantic boulder in the middle of the trail, which normally would have been fine. You would have been able to actually kind of put your upright mountain bike tire, just one tire in between the two rock features. However, since I have a three-wheeled bike and a different design, this boulder in the middle of the trail suddenly required me to ask for help. So just little things like that. Like, we don't want to necessarily like sanitize or make the trails easier, but there are ways that we can design them that kind of include more people. A big thing that I was also talking about is exposure. So depending on the trail width and some of the other things that I have to consider, exposure can be a very tricky and dangerous situation for me. So there are different ways that we can start to approach this, and I'm learning this through the different groups that I've been working with. There are ways to design trails for many different types of users. So individuals that may be using trikes, or maybe using upright bikes with e-assist, or even thinking about people that are using, pedal powered bikes but have adaptations. And in general, everyone benefits from accessibility and the thoughtfulness around these accessible features. Nobody's asking for trails to be easier or sanitized, right? But thinking about ways to integrate adaptive riders and riders of all types into the design process. All in all, I tell people just be open to learning about other people's needs. Something I often say is what's accessible to me might not be accessible to someone else, and what's accessible to somebody else might not be accessible to me. No two people are alike. So I often get asked this question is, how can I support adaptive riders and para off-road cyclists? So the first thing is start to follow adaptive riders and para athletes. Start to see what their world looks like. Start to know what kinds of things they're encountering, what kinds of things they're getting up to, and then you could find ways to support them. You can also start to connect with adaptive and parasport clubs, societies, and groups. So in a lot of cities and towns, there might be a local group that hosts biking, kayaking, skiing, all sorts of activities. And you can start to engage with that group and find out ways that you maybe can support. Maybe you're interested in just giving a donation, or maybe you actually want to volunteer. There's going to be lots of opportunities. A really big thing that I've started to notice and tell people is approach riders with kindness. You may see a bike on a trail that you're unfamiliar with, or you may see somebody riding in a different way. And something you could say to a rider is, whoa, what a cool bike. Or, hey, that's really neat. Can you tell me a little bit about it? But yeah, approach riders with kindness and curiosity. I've had some unfortunate experiences on a trail and trails where people, say things like, oh, look at you, you're out off-roading. Or, oh, what is that? You're not allowed to have that out here. And really, a better way to approach an individual, if you're unsure what they're doing or what the equipment is, just say, what a cool bike. And you could just leave it at that. You also don't need to say anything either. But if you wanted to be a good trail user, you can just, approach somebody with kindness. You can also start to learn about local initiatives in your city, county, and IMBA chapters. You could find out what each of those things are doing in terms of accessibility. So while I am talking about, adaptive mountain biking, you can even find out about what your city is doing about sidewalks or about paratransit programs. All of these things are really connected, even if you might not realize at first. And then also some people say, I don't know any adaptive athletes or para athletes. Well, now you do, me. And so there are different ways to support people in so many ways. So yeah, at this point, I'm going to go to my last slide and then we'll open it up for questions. But I just wanted to do a really big thanks to my sponsors and partners. these folks are allowing me to be able to be in this space and move forward this season. And I'm really grateful for all of the support I've received this year. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I have learned a lot, which I really appreciate. I appreciate about all these workshops, just being able to learn myself. And thank you for taking time on your birthday to be here with us. We feel very honored.
Yeah, it's such a huge privilege to be here, especially on my birthday. I'm like, wow, it's just full circle in so many ways.
Oh, that's good. It's magical. Yeah, if anybody from who's watching live, if you have questions, comments, or if you want Annijke to dive deeper into any of the things already mentioned, feel free to drop that in the chat on YouTube. We are watching and we can respond. But I do have some questions of my own to start. And actually, well, no, yeah, I'll dive into the questions. I know for me, learning more about adaptive athletes and cyclists, and well, just people in general, hadn't really come into the forefront of my mind until a few years ago, when I started working at this nonprofit concerning bikes. And they worked a lot with trying to improve infrastructure for alternative transportation and everything. And it was very eye-opening. And so I think, for one, I can just say I'm glad that we're kind of giving more exposure to it. I'm glad that you're doing work to try to bring it more to the front of the conversations within the cycling community, so that people are just aware, because y'all are out here and you're killing it. And we should be able to support, y'all being on bikes too, or I should say cycles rather. Mm-hmm. But I know one of the biggest struggles for me is figuring out like the language. And I know you touched on this a little bit in the beginning about being very specific in how you describe your circumstances. And I wonder if you have maybe just like a few key points of like what not to do, or any resources about figuring out like what's the best way to figure out what kind of language to use.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that comes up a lot. I was actually just talking with somebody today about this, right? So one thing in general is using, for person first language. So I am a person with a disability, not, a disabled person. And I'm still, learning about that as well. Another thing is, I'm a full-time wheelchair user, or I'm a person that uses a wheelchair. I'm not a wheelchair. I'm not, confined to my wheelchair. I'm not bound to my wheelchair. So little things like that can just be, a game changer for interacting. But I would say, if you're ever unsure, it's okay to ask questions. It's also okay to look up information online too, right? And like try to figure out what's the best way to engage with a person. But, first and foremost, people with disabilities and people that are living with disabilities are just people like you and I. And so I think in so many ways, people are worried about maybe saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And it's like, sometimes we just need to take a step back and remember, hey, this is a person. How would I want to interact with this person? And, even when asking if a person needs help, right? Like it's so important to ask for consent around that and just say, hey, would you like any help? And sometimes that can also be triggering to a person with a disability as well, right? Like being viewed that like maybe you need help. There's been so many times where I'm like pushing up a really steep hill in my wheelchair and somebody is like, hey, do you need any help? Like it looks like you need help. And yeah, sometimes it's just hard. And sometimes I will accept the help. And sometimes I will just be like, no, thank you so much. I've got this. Or if I'm loading my wheelchair up in my car. But it's really important that you don't just like go and do the thing and just like push the person up the hill or,
Mhm.
pick up a person's mobility device and move it out of the way. And something you should never do is, around a full-time wheelchair user, like physically move a person out of the way. I've had some friends that have been grocery shopping and, maybe in like a tight aisle, and impatient people just pick that person up and move them out of the way. And, it's once again, remember, this is a human being and a person. So like treat people with respect. But it is kind of exciting to be in a space where I feel like the culture is changing and people are just really open to learning on how to support.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. I'm definitely one to Google things, but
Yeah.
within reason, of course. Make
Yeah.
sure I find reasonable sources and respectable people actually speaking on the topic and not just, some of them forums and stuff might be a little biased. So definitely
Yeah.
tread lightly on that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Be careful about the stuff you're reading. But I did want to just add something too. Like it's really important too to like be kind of like appropriate too when you're asking questions. So something that is really triggering to people is you say like, well, what happened to you? Or how did you get like this? Or why are you like this? And you know, that can bring up so much trauma for a person depending on maybe how they interact with their disability, or maybe how they acquire their disability, or the pain that they've dealt with being born with the disability. So just being really careful about that. And in so many ways, like, right, it doesn't matter what happened to a person or how they became disabled, right? And so just being like careful about those conversations, I would say too.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, of course, I can't speak for my own personal experience, but it would seem like, there are certain traumas in life in general that you can't necessarily see, that people wouldn't bother to poke and prod about, but yet because
Yeah.
it might be a disability, might be visual, it might be apparent, something that you can see, people feel, I think sometimes like they have a sort of, I don't want to say entitlement, but just because they can see it, they think they can ask questions about it and that it's something to talk about. But it's also a trauma. And just like internal trauma can kind of have the right to be guarded and not shared, I think that's the same thing for physical trauma. And I do hope people respect that.
Yeah.
And you also talked a lot about accessibility, which I
Mhm.
really appreciate. And of course, the Bronco Wild Fund really is kind of focused on preservation and accessibility of public lands and outdoor spaces. I wonder if there are any like trail systems or bike parks that you think are a pretty good example of what we would hope to see from these spaces. And totally fair if there aren't any. But maybe what you think would be kind of a top qualifier, and if there's room for improvement, maybe what more they could do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is something I've been confronted with really head on since acquiring a disability, is like trying to figure out, where can I ride? And so I will say that certain bike parks are like doing really well. Winter Park in Colorado has a bike park called Trestle, and Winter Park is home to an adaptive sports org, the NSCD. So there's kind of like bits and pieces of accessibility that have already been baked in due to their adaptive winter sports programs. And so that's a place that I've heard is like really great for mountain biking. I haven't ridden there yet. But I also know that there's been a big push, in BC through Kootenay Adaptive Sport Association around really kind of dialing in the trails that an adaptive rider can use using like specific trail qualifications and circumstances. Bentonville does have a lot of adaptive trails. JP McGee an adaptive rider that everyone should follow, is doing a really great job of riding the trails within, the Bentonville area and classifying trails. He also posts that information on Trail Forks. So for new adaptive riders, it's a really great place to like download routes. And he doesn't just ride in Bentonville, he rides all over the country. So actually my partner and I like grabbed one of his routes off Trail Forks the other day and put it on our bike computer. And we're like, okay, we're going to ride that one really soon. Because, he's like done all of that work. And then I do know kind of like in the Old Fort area and Knoxville, there's been a really keen eye to accessibility as well. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. That's plenty of great examples.
Yeah.
I think that's really great. One thing I have heard is that there might be a little bit of kind of debate about, of course, there are already plenty of resources for trails in general, but not a ton to explain accessibility, and that there are kind of different houses of thought in how the accessibility should be communicated, especially when there's such a wide spectrum of levels of adaptive bikes. Like you shoot. You had shown several examples, which doesn't even cover like how many options there are for adaptive bikes. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what's really most important in explaining how accessible it is. I guess you did touch on the width of the trail, the camber, but I wonder if you have, like, if there was a dream app that I hope people are working on already.
Yeah.
But like, how would you imagine like you pulling up a route? What are the key things it might say that you would be looking for?
Yeah, and you're touching on like exactly where we are in this sport right now. So like, so mountain bikes, trails have, different rating systems. So you have like a green circle, you've got a blue circle, blue square, and each of those things kind of relates to different trail features that you could encounter, like, the slope, or how steep it is, the grade, or, if it's technical, if it's jump line. And so there are some trail rating systems that are kind of out there for adaptive. But once again, like, it's all equipment dependent, right? It's about the equipment you're using. It's about, what level of function you have with your disability. So for me personally, what I want to see is I want to see descriptions of the trails, right? Like, I think ratings are great, but I also really want to see, at the trailhead or on these apps, like a breakdown of exactly what the features are. So there's a bridge, the first quarter mile of the trail, the bridge is, 42 inches wide or something. Or, there's a steep section, this grade with exposure. And so kind of calling out those sections of trail that could be challenging depending on your disability or the type of equipment, I think would be really cool. Because sometimes I'm like looking on the apps and I'm like, okay, I see a green trail. And then we get there and there's a little skinny bridge that I can't really get over. And we're like, well, that's a bummer, because this trail is great, but I'm not able to really utilize it. So yeah. So descriptions would be awesome.
Yeah, I could see how, I mean, that is one downside of just like some of these apps in general, is a lot of them don't really have descriptions anyway, but I can see how just that one little feature, even if it's at the trailhead, it could prevent the entire ride from happening.
Absolutely.
That'd be cool. I wonder if it would also be very cool if there was a way that like the bike specification, and this is me geeking out because I love this kind of stuff, but like if the bike model could be like inserted into your profile, and then it could tell you automatically like, oh, based on the specs of this bike,
Oh yeah,
maybe these trails would be more accessible just based on
that would be cool.
That would be.
Yeah, like bring in some AI to be able to be like, hey, this is your bike, this is your riding level, these are the trails you can access. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
app builders are listening, let's do it.
Please take notes. I'll
Yeah,
let
yeah.
you have that one because I know I don't have the money for it. So
Right.
I think it's more important it just gets done.
Yeah.
Someone did bring a really good question up. Carla
Mhm.
King asked, outside of mountain bike specific rec areas, are there spaces in the backcountry of national parks that are welcoming to adaptive mountain bikers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, because my bike is technically like an off road wheelchair or an off road mobility device, I am able to use my bike in areas that are not like mountain bike specific. So, my bike actually doubles, as like the way that I hike, the way that I can trail run. It's just a way that I can access the outdoors. And so, I am able to have access to like national parks. I can also, ride my bike on the beach. I can ride my bike in the snow. Um, but there are some places too that are not as welcoming, right? Like, so a lot of national parks, there's specific like accessible loops that you can use, or I could maybe bring my bike to certain places, but there are areas that are still out of reach. I have a good friend that's a creator. Her name is Amanda, and her account is called National Park Capable. And so, if you're interested in seeing more about like national parks and accessibility, she's your person. She does a really fantastic job of like explaining what's accessible in certain places and what's not.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, because there's
Yeah.
definitely some parks I know that like won't allow electric assist
Mm-hmm.
in certain places of the park, which it is a little frustrating with the electrical assistance on bikes that there are spaces where they don't allow them, especially when
Mm-hmm.
a lot of adaptive bikes rely on the electrical assistance.
Right.
Um, Personally, I think it makes more sense to set a limit on speeds. Of course, like that's
Yeah.
no matter what kind of bike you're on, I think there should be speed limits in certain spaces where it could be very dangerous. Um, but that's a great resource that I did not know about. And you said it was national.
National Park Capable.
Okay.
And yeah, you can follow her online on Instagram. But yeah, there's a lot of things that are kind of like popping up around e-assist, right? Like, so I know, quite a few para athletes that absolutely require e-assist even on upright bikes, to be able to mountain bike. And even though they're people with disabilities, they are still encountering challenges when like going to certain trail systems that say like no e-bikes allowed. And it's like, well, you know, when are we going to allow people to be able to utilize and access these trails, right? Like, because it is an access issue. um so yeah, if folks want to get like more ingrained in that conversation, I say there's a lot of work to be done around like destigmatizing e-bikes and showing like, hey, like e-bikes can and should be welcome in a lot of places, and there are many reasons why a person can use an e-bike outside from just the fact that they're fun, right? Like, there's also like some reasons that allow people to go farther, to be able to get outside. So yeah.
Yeah. Someone also brought up a question about, I know there was a mention of how expensive all of this equipment can be.
Mhm.
And not just the equipment itself, but it's just so much more effort just to get to these places now and all that. Tom Parker has mentioned that they're trying to develop an adaptive initiative in Seattle, and they did ask a question about if you happen to know of any grants or organizations who are helping out those kinds of initiatives, if there are any at top of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And first thing, Tom, like, feel free to also reach out to me on my Instagram. Like, I'd love to have a more in-depth conversation over a video chat about this, because I think I've definitely gotten connected with certain buckets of funds of money and resources that could help you. And I could also, just share what I've learned about this. But yeah, it's a very interesting landscape. And sometimes it comes down to like what specific population you're serving, right? So as an individual living with a spinal cord injury, like I have access to specific funds, right? Like, High Fives Foundation, Kelly Brush Foundation. But there are different funds for different types of disabilities. But you're also working with children. So I do have a couple ideas. I know some like traditional grants and organizations like Outride Fund. So that could be a good resource for you. They are not adaptive specific. There's also Craig Nielsen, and they grant you. They have grant cycles like on a yearly basis. But yeah, this is a conversation like I'd love to have with you, Tom, offline and talk more about it. And also I'm just curious to know like what y'all are up to, because it sounds really cool. I want to come ride.
Oh yes, that's
right?
awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that's what I also love about these workshops, is the ability to just like network and find out more in depth about all the stuff people got going on. That's really awesome, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for being willing to share and let us know what you got going on. Hopefully some good comes out of that. We are getting close to the top of the hour. So I will add your contact info kind of towards the end of this.
Okay.
But if there are any specific ways of how people can support your work right now, or just within this next year, if you can let us know kind of where to support you, and also maybe what you're most looking forward to this year.
Yeah, so this year is going to be really fun for me. I'm going to continue, mountain biking, but I'm also going to be doing some para off-road cycling in the gravel world. So that's going to be really fun. I'm excited to like get back to that and hang out with my friends at gravel events. So that's going to be really fun and exciting. And then I have a few like little projects kind of cooking up. So I'll announce those like later on in the season. But yeah, if people want to like get in touch with me or like stay engaged at, in what I'm doing, the best way is through Instagram or TikTok. And it's at Geodesic Dome. So GeodesicDome. And you can reach out that way and find out ways to support. So yeah, there we go. Yep. And I've got a website too.
I figured I would just sprinkle that in there,
Totally. Yeah. And I'm still working on that. So there's like a splash page, but I'm like in the process of like, I'll relaunch my website in a couple months. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, this video is going to live on our YouTube, a Quick Brown Fox YouTube, for the foreseeable future. So feel free to access communications and what Annijke's got going on at those spaces below. And we are so gracious for you for spending time with us today on your special birthday to share with us your story and your knowledge and your wisdom and just what you're looking forward to, what we all hope to continue to see within the growth of adaptability sports. And yeah, hopefully this is the start of a conversation that will continue to grow and blossom and become something even more beautiful. And yeah, I think that's all for this workshop.
Yeah, thank you. This has been awesome. And yeah, thanks to everyone that showed up and to all of our interpreters too. And this has just been really fabulous. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yes. All right. Well, that is all for now for our February The Abundance workshop. Thanks to our partners and Bronco Wild Fund. We look forward to seeing y'all again for our next workshop. And We out.
Great. Thank you. Bye.